have you ever been somebody? Have you ever been somewhere where like just there's only one person in your entire life that you actually care about?
The story of Matt Brown represents one of reality television's most tragic and cautionary tales, a narrative arc that descended from hope and visibility into isolation and despair. What began as a young man's journey into the public eye through one of Discovery Channel's most watched programs evolved into a complex struggle with family dynamics, media manipulation, and the psychological toll of living under constant scrutiny. The title that emerged from his final statements before his death captured something raw and unfiltered about his inner emotional state, revealing depths of pain and resentment that viewers had never fully witnessed during his years on screen. Understanding the full context of that admission requires examining not just what happened in his life, but why it happened and how the systems around him both enabled and accelerated his downward spiral. When Alaskan Bush People debuted on the Discovery Channel on May 6, 2014, it introduced audiences to a family seemingly frozen in time, living according to principles that most modern Americans had abandoned generations ago. Billy Brown stood as a patriarch, a man with strong convictions about self-reliance, family loyalty, and the superiority of wilderness living over urban civilization. His vision of the Brown family was presented as an alternative to mainstream society, a rejection of materialism and dependence on systems that he viewed as corrupting and weakening. The show's initial appeal lay in its apparent authenticity, the idea that viewers were seeing real people living genuinely different lives rather than manufactured drama scripted for entertainment. Matt Brown, as the oldest son, was positioned as the heir to his father's philosophy and the primary executor of Billy's ambitious projects. He appeared in virtually every major storyline during the show's first seasons, working alongside his father to construct shelters, navigate dangerous waters, and establish settlements that would allow the family to sustain themselves in harsh conditions. For audiences watching from suburban homes and urban apartments, Matt represented something almost mythological, a young man unshackled from social media, consumer culture, and the expectations that typically constrain his generation. The reality of Matt's experience, however, diverged significantly from a narrative being broadcast to millions of viewers. While the show presented the Brown family as a unit operating with perfect synchronization and mutual support, the actual dynamics within the family system were far more fractured and complicated. Matt's role required him to be simultaneously a son obedient to his father's authority, a television personality whose image was being controlled by producers, and an individual trying to develop his own identity separate from the collective Wolfpack brand. This triple burden created psychological pressures that were largely invisible to audiences, but increasingly visible in Matt's behavior and choices as the years progressed. The contradiction between the person he was expected to be on camera and the person he actually was off camera generated a cognitive dissonance that took a measurable psychological toll. His participation in the show meant that his labor, his image, and his time were being commodified and sold for profit. Yet the distribution of those profits within the family structure remained opaque and unequal. By 2016, when Matt first entered rehabilitation for alcohol addiction, the cracks in this constructed reality became publicly visible for the first time. The man who had been presented as a capable outdoorsman and devoted family member was struggling with substance abuse, a revelation that forced both the show's producers and the viewing audience to reconsider their understanding of what they were watching. Recovery from alcohol addiction is rarely a linear process, and Matt's experience was no exception. He underwent treatment at the Betty Ford Center, one of the nation's most respected facilities for addressing addiction, but the underlying issues that had contributed to his addiction remained largely unaddressed. The family's public response to his addiction focused on the medical and psychological aspects of substance abuse recovery, while avoiding any examination of the family system itself, the production environment, or the pressures that had contributed to his struggles. This approach, while seeming compassionate on the surface, essentially placed all responsibility for Matt's problems on his individual shoulders, while absolving the systems surrounding him of any culpability. The emergence of Ami Brown's stage 3 lung cancer diagnosis in April 2017 added another layer of crisis to an already fragile situation. The family's attention and resources shifted dramatically toward her treatment and survival, a redirection that was understandable from a compassionate standpoint, but that also meant Matt's ongoing recovery needs received less attention and support. While Ami underwent aggressive chemotherapy and radiation treatments in Southern California, The rest of the family eventually relocated to support her, effectively creating a physical separation between Matt and the family unit. This separation was never explicitly framed as a punishment or rejection, but it functioned as one nonetheless. Matt's appearances on the show became increasingly sporadic, his presence on camera less essential to the narrative that producers were building. By the time filming relocated permanently to Washington State, and the North Star Ranch property became the show's primary setting, Matt had become almost peripheral to the family's public identity. The show continued to be about the Browns, but not about Matt in any meaningful way. What made this gradual erasure particularly damaging was that it occurred without honest communication or acknowledgement. There was no dramatic confrontation that might have allowed for resolution or even clear understanding of what was happening. Instead, Matt simply faded from the show's structure while remaining technically connected to the family unit and the production. This liminal state, existing between insider and outsider, created a unique form of psychological torment. He was not fully rejected, which might have at least provided clarity and closure, nor was he fully accepted and supported. Instead, he occupied a middle space where his presence was tolerated but not valued, where his contributions to the show's success were essentially forgotten or minimized. His second voluntary admission to rehabilitation in September 2018 represented another attempt to address his substance abuse struggles, but also represented a continuation of a pattern where his problems were treated as individual failures rather than symptoms of larger systemic dysfunction. By 2019, Matt had effectively disappeared from Alaskan Bush People, though this disappearance was never officially announced or explained. His role had been absorbed by his brothers and gradually erased from the show's ongoing narrative. When viewers tuned in to watch new episodes, they no longer saw Matt, and the show's structure had been reorganized in such a way that his absence felt natural and required no explanation. Promotional materials featuring the Brown family no longer included him. Cast interviews rarely mentioned him, and younger viewers who discovered the show during later seasons might never fully understand the role he had once played. This erasure from the show's narrative paralleled his gradual separation from the family unit itself. While Billy and Ami continued to be central to the show and their public identity remained strong, Matt existed in isolation, living independently and removed from the filming schedule that continued to define the rest of his family's existence. The death of Billy Brown in February 2021 represented a seismic shift in the family's structure, removing the patriarchal figure around whom the entire family identity had been constructed. For Matt, his father's death occurred while he was already separated from the family in the show, when communication between them had become limited and strained. In the aftermath of Billy's death, Matt made occasional public statements indicating that he had reached some form of peace regarding his father before his passing, suggesting that at least some reconciliation or acceptance had occurred. However, the fundamental issues that had driven them apart remained largely unresolved and unaddressed. The opportunity for genuine healing had passed, leaving Matt with the knowledge that whatever relationship he and his father might have rebuilt would now have to occur in memory rather than in real time. The void left by Billy's death and Matt's ongoing separation from the family was eventually filled by Matt's own voice, speaking directly to the public without intermediaries. Beginning in 2021, he began posting videos to social media platforms where he addressed viewers and the broader public with his perspective on his experiences within the show and the family system. These videos represented the first time since the series premiered that Matt was telling his own story in his own words without producers filtering his message or framing his narrative. What he revealed in these videos was a portrait of someone who had felt systematically marginalized, financially exploited, and psychologically damaged by the systems designed to profit from his labor and image. He described feeling that his contributions to the show's success had not been adequately compensated, that his concerns about production practices and family dynamics had been dismissed because of his history with addiction, and that his reputation had been manipulated in editing and story selection to serve the show's interests rather than his own. These allegations, while unverified and never resulting in legal action or findings of confirmation, presented a starkly different perspective on the Brown family empire than what had been presented to audiences through the television program. They revealed the existence of tensions and conflicts that had been carefully hidden or minimized on camera. They suggested that the family unit's apparent cohesion and Billy's patriarchal authority had been maintained in part through financial control and the dismissal of legitimate concerns raised by family members. Most significantly, they demonstrated that Matt's addiction, rather than being simply a personal failing or medical condition unrelated to his life circumstances, might have been partially a symptom of psychological distress caused by a situation within the family and production system. The statement that emerged from his final period of isolation and struggle, the admission that he utterly hated someone, presumably his mother Ami or another family member, represented a breaking point in his emotional state. This was not a casual remark or an offhand comment made in anger that would quickly pass. It was a deliberate, conscious admission of profound negative feelings towards someone within his family. The fact that this statement emerged toward the end of his life, as he was increasingly isolated and struggling with the aftermath of years spent dealing with addiction, family conflict, and public erasure, suggested that these feelings had been accumulating over an extended period. They represented the emotional residue of years spent feeling unsupported, undervalued, and exploited within the systems that had defined his public identity and shaped his adult life. What made Matt's final tragedy in May 2026 particularly devastating was that it occurred within a context of isolation from the systems that might have provided him with support and intervention. He was living independently, separated from both the show and the family structure, dealing with ongoing struggles related to addiction and mental health without the kind of consistent, reliable support that might have made a difference. When he was reported missing in late May and subsequently discovered in the Okanagan River near Oroville, Washington, it marked the tragic conclusion of a journey that had begun with so much promise and visibility. The body recovered from the river belonged to a man who had once been presented to millions as a symbol of strength, capability, and dedication to family values, but who had instead become a casualty of the very systems that had made him famous. The preliminary findings by authorities, which suggested that his death appeared to be self-inflicted, indicated that Matt had made a deliberate choice to end his life. This tragic decision did not emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from years of struggling with addiction, from a family system that seemed unwilling or unable to genuinely support his recovery, from a television production that had profited from his labor while dismissing his concerns and complaints, and from a public identity that no longer served any purpose in his life, and that had become instead a burden he could no longer bear. The admission that he utterly hated someone, which had emerged during his final period of isolation, represented the culmination of emotions that had been building throughout his adult life. It represented the surface expression of a much deeper pain, a pain rooted in betrayal, exploitation, and the loss of hope that things could ever meaningfully improve. In the aftermath of his death, the Brown family released statements expressing grief and remembering Matt as a creative, intelligent, and curious person who loved the outdoors. These remembrances, while perhaps sincere, came too late to matter to the person being remembered. They represent an attempt to reshape the narrative surrounding Matt's life and death in the immediate aftermath of tragedy, but they could not undo the years of isolation, the lack of genuine support, or the systemic failures that had contributed to his death. What remains is a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing family relationships with reality television production, about the psychological costs of commodifying people's lives for profit, and about the ways that systems of control and power can operate within families under the guise of tradition and togetherness. Matt Brown's story is ultimately a tragedy not because he struggled with addiction or mental health, but because the systems surrounding him failed to provide him with genuine love, support, and the recognition that his humanity and well-being mattered more than the content and ratings generated by his participation in a television show.